Imagine being an experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours preparing for a route you know by heart, under an apparently perfect sky. You conduct your pre-flight inspection, wave to witnesses on the tarmac, climb into your aircraft, and take off toward the horizon. And then you simply disappear. No radio signal calling for help. No wreckage found despite massive searches. Only absolute silence, where before there had been the roar of an engine. And when the truth finally emerges, 63 years later, it comes from the bottom of a gorge so deep and densely covered by forest that it seemed impossible that something as large as an airplane could have been hidden there all along. Before we dive into this story that challenges everything you think you know about aerial searches and disappearances, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Because the case you are about to discover is one of the most disturbing aviation mysteries in American history. This is not just the story of a man who fell from the sky. It is the story of how nature can completely swallow a half-ton aircraft, how extensive searches can pass within meters of what they are looking for without finding it, and how sometimes the truth remains buried not by conspiracy or crime, but simply because the forest decided to keep its secrets. The story begins in an era when private aviation was flourishing in America, where pilots were romantic figures of freedom and adventure, and where disappearing in the skies often meant never being found. Andrew Michael Johnson was 37 years old in August of 1962, and to anyone in Durango, Colorado, he represented everything a pilot should be: confident but not reckless, experienced but always respectful of the skies, and as dedicated to aviation as other men were to their families. At 1 meter and 78 centimeters tall, with the athletic build of someone who spent hours maintaining aircraft, blonde hair that the Colorado sun had lightened even more, and blue eyes that always seemed to be measuring distances and wind conditions, Andrew had that appearance of someone who belonged to the air as much as to the earth. Born on June 3, 1925 in Seattle, Washington, Andrew grew up in an era when aviation still carried the magic of pioneers. His father, William Johnson, worked as an engineer for Boeing, and Andrew literally grew up around aircraft. At 5 years old, he could already identify aircraft models by the sound of their engines. At 10, he helped his father perform maintenance on a small biplane that William kept in a nearby field. At 15, he made his first solo flight, technically illegal given his age, but his father supervised and never officially reported it. World War II interrupted Andrew's civilian dreams. In 1943, at 18 years old, he enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. He was trained as a transport pilot and spent the Itoyuri last 2 years of the war flying supply missions over the Pacific. Dangerous routes where the enemy was not so much combat as unpredictable weather and vast oceans without reference points. Andrew flew 247 missions without a single accident, earning a reputation as an exceptionally careful and competent pilot. After the war, in 1946, Andrew returned to Seattle but discovered that civilian life did not satisfy him. He tried working for Boeing like his father, but staying in a factory suffocated him. What Andrew wanted was to fly. In 1948, at 23 years old, he used his military service savings and a bank loan to buy a used Cessna 140, a small 2-seat airplane, but it was his. He spent the next few years doing freelance work, small charter flights, light cargo transport, even crop dusting in the summer. It was not glamorous, but it kept him in the air. In 1951, he met Patricia Sanders, a 24-year-old teacher who was visiting Seattle. She had hired Andrew for a tourist flight over Mount Rainier, and before the flight ended, Both knew that something special had begun. They married in April of 1952, and Patricia quickly adapted to life as a pilot's wife, a life of irregular schedules and constant worries, but also of freedom and adventure. In 1954, Andrew and Patricia moved to Durango, Colorado. Andrew had secured a contract with a small aviation services company, Mountain Sky Aviation, which operated charter flights, mail transport to remote Rocky Mountain communities, and occasionally search and rescue work. Durango, situated in southwestern Colorado at an altitude of 2,000 meters, offered the type of challenging flying that Andrew loved. Mountains, variable winds, conditions that changed rapidly. The couple rented a small but charming house near the Durango-La Plata County Airport. It was a one-story wooden construction with a view of the mountains, with a porch where Andrew and Patricia sat on summer evenings, he pointing out constellations and she reading while listening to his voice. They wanted children, and Patricia became pregnant in 1955, giving birth to a girl, Sarah, in February of 1956. 2 years later, a boy, William, was born in September of 1958, named in honor of Andrew's father. Andrew was a dedicated father between flights. He took Sarah to see the airplanes in the hangar, letting her sit in the pilot's seat while he explained each instrument. He taught William, still a baby, to make airplane engine sounds. But his true passion would always be flying. Patricia understood and accepted this. She had married knowing she was competing with the sky for her husband's attention, and she never tried to change him. In 1959, Andrew finally realized a long-standing dream. He bought his own airplane. Not through Mountain Sky Aviation, but as personal property. It was a Cessna 182, a 4-seat single-engine aircraft manufactured in 1958. It cost him $14,500, a fortune that required a significant loan, but Andrew considered every cent well spent. The Cessna 182 was known for its reliability, versatility, and ability to operate on short and rough runways, perfect for the Colorado mountains. Andrew called the airplane Sky Dancer and painted the name in elegant blue letters along the fuselage. The registered tail number was November 4782 Charlie. He kept the airplane in impeccable condition, doing all possible maintenance himself, hiring certified mechanics only for work that regulations required to be done by professionals. Andrew's routine was dictated by weather and contracts. Some days he flew multiple times. Other days, weather conditions kept him grounded. But whenever he flew, he followed the same meticulous ritual. Complete pre-flight inspection, checking every aspect of the airplane, weather condition verification, careful route planning, and always filing a flight plan when appropriate. Andrew had accumulated, by August of 1962, more than 5,200 hours of flight time. For context, most modern commercial pilots have between 1,500 and 3,000 hours when they begin flying for airlines. Andrew was exceptionally experienced. He knew the Rocky Mountains like he knew the faces of his own children. He had flown in all types of conditions: snow, rain, strong winds, severe turbulence. He had dealt with engine failures, with loss of instruments, with situations that would have panicked less experienced pilots. He was also known for being extremely cautious. His colleagues joked that Andrew would cancel flights if a cloud looked suspicious. He never took unnecessary risks. If the weather was bad, he waited. If something about the airplane seemed unusual, he would not take off until investigating. This caution had kept him alive through 17 years of professional aviation in some of the most challenging conditions in America. Andrew had few vices or eccentricities. He did not drink alcohol, a strict personal rule he maintained even at social occasions. He did not smoke. His only indulgence was strong coffee, which he consumed in impressive quantities. He was an active member of the local aviators club, where he shared stories and advice with younger pilots. He was respected not just for his skill, but for his willingness to help others. Patricia had learned to live with constant worry. Every flight carried risk, especially in the mountains where weather could change in minutes and where a miscalculation could mean colliding with a slope. But she trusted Andrew, his experience, his judgment. And most of the time, she managed to keep her anxiety under control. But sometimes, late at night, when Andrew was on a night flight, Patricia lay awake listening to every sound, waiting to hear the Cessna returning. And in those moments, she wondered how long their luck would last. Because deep down, every pilot and every pilot's family knows it is just a matter of when, not if, something will go wrong. The question was only whether it would be something they could survive. In August of 1962, Andrew Johnson's life was in a good place. Financially, things were stable. His children were healthy and growing. His relationship with Patricia was strong. His aviation business was thriving. He had just turned 37 and, by all external indicators, had decades of flying ahead of him. But fate had other plans, and on a summer afternoon that seemed perfectly ordinary, Andrew Johnson would embark on a flight that would take him not to his planned destination, but to a deep gorge where he would remain hidden for more than 6 decades, while his family, friends, and authorities wondered eternally what had happened to one of Colorado's most experienced and cautious pilots. The morning of August 23, 1962, dawned clear and bright over Durango, Colorado. The sky was that deep, intense blue characteristic of high altitude, without a single visible cloud. The temperature at 6 o'clock in the morning was a pleasant 15 degrees Celsius, with forecast to reach 26 degrees in the afternoon. The wind was calm, only 5 to 8 kilometers per hour, coming from the southwest. For pilots, these were almost perfect conditions. Andrew woke at 5:30, his usual time on flying days. Patricia was still asleep, as were the children, 6-year-old Sarah and 3-year-old William. He prepared coffee in the silent kitchen, scrambled eggs with toast, while mentally reviewing the flight planned for that day. It was a familiar route, Durango to Cortez, a city about 70 kilometers to the west, to deliver mail and some small packages to the local postal agency. Estimated flight time, 25 minutes. A routine run that Andrew had literally done hundreds of times. At 6:45, Patricia came down to the kitchen, still in her robe. Andrew was dressed in his usual flying clothes: jeans, plaid flannel shirt, brown leather jacket, sturdy boots. "Beautiful day to fly," she commented, serving herself coffee. "Perfect," agreed Andrew. "I will be back around 10. I thought we could take the children for a picnic in the afternoon. Take advantage of the good weather." "They would love that," said Patricia, smiling. She walked up to him and adjusted his shirt collar, a habitual gesture. "Fly safe." "I always do," he replied, kissing her forehead. At 7:15, Andrew left home. He drove his 1959 Ford F-100 the 5 minutes to Durango La Plata County Airport, a small general aviation airport with 2 asphalt runways and about 20 private hangars. The airport was beginning to come to life. Some, other pilots arriving, a mechanic opening a workshop, the control tower employee preparing for the shift. Andrew parked near the hangar where he kept the Sky Dancer. The Cessna 182 was tied up outside. He usually kept it in the hangar, but had left it out the previous night after cleaning the interior. The airplane gleamed in the morning light, its white exterior with blue stripe recently washed and polished. At 7:30, Andrew began his pre-flight inspection. It was a ritual he performed religiously before each flight, no matter how many times he had already flown the airplane. He started at the nose, checking the propeller for cracks or damage. He opened the engine cowling, checked the oil. Perfect level. Clean color. He checked fuel filters. He walked around the fuselage, examining each panel, each rivet, looking for anything out of the ordinary. He checked the flaps, the ailerons, the rudder, the elevators, all the movable control surfaces. He shook the wings to feel if there was play in the hinges. He checked the tires, the pressure seeming adequate to touch. He drained a small fuel sample from each tank to check for water contamination. Clean and clear fuel. The inspection took 20 minutes. Andrew found nothing wrong. The Sky Dancer was in perfect condition to fly. Around 7:55, Andrew was loading the cargo into the baggage compartment behind the rear seats. 5 bags of postal mail, 3 small boxes containing machine parts for a workshop in Cortez, total of approximately 30 kilograms. Well within the weight limits of the Cessna 182. At 8:05, Tom Harrison, another pilot who kept his airplane in a nearby hangar, arrived for his own morning flight. He waved to Andrew. "Going to Cortez?" asked Tom, walking over to him. "As always," replied Andrew. "You?" "Instructional flight with a student at 9. Perfect day for it." They talked for a few minutes about wind conditions, about a new FAA regulation, about nothing in particular. Tom would later remember that Andrew seemed completely normal, relaxed, focused, without any sign of concern or nervousness. At 8:15, Andrew entered the Sky Dancer's cabin. He sat in the pilot's seat, adjusted his seatbelt, put on his headphones. He began his pre-start checklist. Instrument check, altimeter adjustment for local barometric pressure, radio check. Everything working perfectly. At 8:20, Andrew started the engine. The Continental 04, 76-cylinder roared to life. That familiar and comforting sound that every pilot loves. Andrew let the engine warm up for 2 minutes, checking temperatures and oil pressures. Everything in the green. At 8:22, Andrew contacted the control tower by radio. "Durango Tower, Cessna 4782 Charlie, requesting taxi for takeoff. Runway 21, VFR flight to Cortez." "Cessna 82 Charlie, cleared taxi to runway 21 via taxiway Alpha," responded the controller. A man named Robert Chen, who had known Andrew for years. Andrew taxied carefully to the threshold of runway 21. He did his final engine check. Magnetos, fuel mixture, flight controls. Everything perfect. At 8:28, he received clearance for takeoff. "Cessna 82 Charlie, cleared for takeoff runway 21, wind 230 at 6 knots, altimeter 30.15. "Cleared for takeoff, 82 Charlie, confirmed Andrew. He aligned the airplane on the E-Amper runway, added power gradually. The Cessna accelerated, 40 knots, 50 knots, 60 knots. At rotation speed, Andrew gently pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted, the wheels left the asphalt, and the Sky Dancer climbed gracefully into the crystalline morning air. Tom Harrison watched the takeoff from the ground, where he was preparing his own airplane. Perfect takeoff as always, he thought, seeing the Cessna gain altitude, turning gradually to the west. At 8:30, Andrew reported to the tower. "Durango Tower, 82 Charlie, leaving your control area, changing to common frequency." Roger 8-2 Charlie. Good flight, responded Chen. These were the last words anyone heard from Andrew Johnson. The flight to Cortez should have taken about 25 minutes. The route followed generally westward, passing over mountainous terrain covered by dense pine forests, occasional rock formations, and some deep valleys cut by ancient glacial rivers. The cruising altitude that Andrew typically used for this flight was 3,000 to 3,500 meters, high enough to comfortably clear all terrain features, but not so high as to require supplemental oxygen. The Cortez airport expected Andrew around 8:55. When 9 o'clock passed without sign of the Cessna, the airport manager, a man named Frank Morrison, began to get slightly worried, but not alarmed. Delays happened. Perhaps Andrew had decided to make a detour, or had minor mechanical problems and returned to Durango. At 9:15, Morrison called the Durango Tower. "Do you have any information about Cessna 8-2 Charlie? He has not arrived here yet." Robert Chen felt a first chill of concern. "He left our area at 8:30 heading to you. Should have arrived 20 minutes ago. Let me check if he contacted any other frequency." Chen spent the next 15 minutes trying to contact Andrew on various radio frequencies. Silence. He contacted other nearby airports. No, one had heard from Cessna 8-2 Charlie. At 9:35, Chen called Tom Harrison, who was still at Durango Airport. "Tom, you saw Andrew take off this morning, right?" "Yes, at 8:28. Why?" "He did not arrive at Cortez. He is not responding to radio. Did you notice anything strange with the airplane or with him?" "Nothing," said Tom, his voice now tense. "He was fine. The airplane looked fine. Takeoff was perfect." Chen then made the call that no controller wants to make. He called Patricia Johnson. When the phone rang at 9:42, Patricia was in the living room playing with William while Sarah drew at the kitchen table. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" "Mrs. Johnson, this is Robert Chen from Durango Tower. I do not want to alarm you, but we are trying to locate Andrew. He did not arrive at Cortez as planned." Patricia's world tilted. "What do you mean, did not arrive?" "He took off at 8:28, reported leaving our area at 8:30, and since then, no one has had contact with him. We are checking all possibilities, but I needed to inform you." Patricia felt her legs weaken. She held onto the wall. "How long has he been missing?" "Over an hour now. But there could be innocent explanations, maybe radio problems, and he landed somewhere." But they both knew that Andrew would never fail to communicate if he had problems. And if he had landed somewhere, he would have found a phone to report. At 10 o'clock, an hour and a half, after Andrew had left Durango, the Civil Air Patrol was alerted. At 10:30, the first search aircraft was in the air. A Piper Cub piloted by volunteers, flying over the presumed route between Durango and Cortez, looking for wreckage or signs of a downed airplane. At 11 o'clock, 3 more search planes were in the air. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, military helicopters from Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico joined the search. The most extensive search and rescue operation in the history of southwestern Colorado had begun. Over the next 5 days, more than 40 aircraft participated in the search. They flew grid patterns over hundreds of square kilometers of mountainous terrain. Civil Air Patrol pilots, military, private volunteers, all scoured the rugged terrain, looking for any sign of the white Cessna with blue stripe. Ground teams were also mobilized. Experienced mountaineers, forest rangers, even trained Boy Scout groups in search and rescue walked through dense forests and climbed steep slopes, shouting Andrew's name, looking for wreckage, listening for any sound of a survivor. Patricia spent those days in a kind of trance. Friends and neighbors took turns staying with her, caring for the children who were too young to fully understand what was happening. Sarah constantly asked when Daddy would come home. William, only 3, felt the tension but could not articulate his confusion. Theories proliferated. Perhaps Andrew had had a medical emergency, a heart attack or stroke. But he was 37 years old, healthy, with no history of heart problems. Perhaps a catastrophic engine failure. But the Cessna was well maintained, and an engine failure did not explain why Andrew had not made an emergency call. He would have had time to at least transmit a mayday before falling. The most likely explanation, which no one wanted to verbalize but everyone thought, was that something had gone very, very wrong very quickly. Perhaps a collision with a large bird breaking the windshield and incapacitating Andrew. Perhaps sudden and severe turbulence breaking the airplane's structure. Perhaps a control failure making the airplane impossible to fly. Something fast enough that Andrew had no time to react. But where was the airplane? In 5 days of intensive searches, not a single piece of wreckage was found. No metallic reflection caught from the air. No trail of broken trees indicating where something large had fallen through the forest. Nothing. After a week, the active search was reduced. After 2 weeks, it was essentially ended, although occasional patrols continued for months. The consensus was sad but inevitable. Cessna 8-2 Charlie had fallen somewhere in the vast mountainous terrain between Durango and Cortez, probably in a location so remote or so obscured by vegetation that even extensive searches could not locate it. Andrew Johnson was declared legally dead in August of 1963, 1 year after his disappearance. Patricia received the life insurance, $25,000 that would help, but would never compensate for the loss. She sold the Sky Dancer, or rather, sold the Sky Dancer's paperwork, since the airplane itself was never found. She sold the house in Durango, the memories being too much to bear, and moved with the children to Denver, where her sister lived. Tom Harrison, who had watched Andrew take off that August morning, carried survivor's guilt for the rest of his aviation career. "If I had gone along," he sometimes said, "maybe I could have helped." But that was irrational thinking. There was no reason for him to have gone, and if he had, he probably would have just died too. The case entered the files as an unresolved aviation accident, tragically common in an era when navigation was less precise, communications less reliable, and search and rescue less technologically advanced than it would become in subsequent decades. Andrew Johnson became a statistic, a name on a list of lost aviators, one more reminder of the dangers inherent in flight. And in a deep gorge in the Colorado Rockies, a white Cessna with blue stripe lay crushed and hidden, slowly being covered by decades of falling leaves and growing vegetation, while the world above moved on and forgot about the man who had fallen from a perfect sky on a perfect morning and simply disappeared. The years covered Andrew Johnson with layers of forgetting. The 1960s gave way to the 70s, then 80s, 90s, and the new millennium. Aviation changed dramatically. GPS, satellite communications, emergency locators. Aviation accidents that continued to happen were found much more quickly. But for those lost in the earlier era, before these technologies, many remained where they fell, forgotten by all except grieving families. Patricia Johnson never remarried. She raised Sarah and William in Denver, working as a secretary to support the family. She never stopped occasionally dreaming about Andrew. Dreams where he walked through the door as if he had never left, or where she saw him from the sky, waving from an airplane that never landed. She died in 2019 at 92 years old, having lived 57 years as the widow of a man whose body was never recovered. Sarah, the 6-year-old daughter who had asked when Daddy would come home, grew up to become a teacher like her mother had been. She married, had her own children, lived a full life. But she always kept a photograph of her father in pilot's uniform on the wall of her living room. When her grandchildren asked about him, she told stories of a man who loved to fly, who had disappeared into the sky on a perfectly clear day, whose fate had remained a mystery throughout her life. William, the 3-year-old son too young to clearly remember his father, grew up with a fascination for aviation that his mother always found painfully ironic. He became an aerospace engineer working on the design of aviation safety systems. Maybe if these systems had existed in 1962, he sometimes thought, my father would still be here. Tom Harrison continued flying until his retirement in 1985. Until the end, every time he flew the route between Durango and Cortez, his eyes scanned the terrain below, some part of him still hoping to see a reflection of metal, sign of the Sky Dancer's wreckage. He never saw anything. Tom died in 2008. Robert Chen, the controller who had taken Andrew's last radio call, carried that moment for the rest of his career. "Cleared for takeoff" were the last words he had said to Andrew Johnson. Chen retired in 1990 and died in 2015, still occasionally wondering what had happened to that Cessna on a perfectly clear August day 63 years earlier. The Cessna 182 itself, the Sky Dancer, November 4, 782 Charlie, remained in FAA records as lost, presumed destroyed, for decades. Occasionally, over the years, hikers or hunters in the mountains between Durango and Cortez reported finding pieces of metal they thought might be from an airplane. Each report triggered investigation. Each time, the fragments were from something else: old mining equipment, discarded trash, even parts of automobiles inexplicably abandoned in remote locations. And then, in 2025, a technological breakthrough where human searches had failed. A mapping company using new LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, was creating high-resolution topographic maps of southwestern Colorado for conservation and forest management purposes. LiDAR uses lasers to map terrain with incredible precision, and crucially, can see through dense forest cover to reveal the ground below. On June 15, 2025, a technician analyzing LiDAR data noticed something unusual in a narrow gorge approximately 35 kilometers west of Durango. There was an anomaly in the ground, a shape that did not match the natural geological formations around it. It was long and narrow, measuring about 8 meters in length by 3 meters in width, and was approximately 6 meters below the level of the surrounding forest, at the bottom of a deep gorge covered by dense layers of trees that had grown in the intervening decades. The technician, curious, marked the location and reported to his supervisor. She, in turn, recognized that this was near the presumed flight route of several aircraft that had disappeared over the years. She contacted local authorities. On June 20th, a Colorado search and rescue team, equipped with ropes and climbing equipment, was dispatched to investigate. It took them 3 hours of hiking through dense forest and careful descent of the steep gorge to reach the coordinates. And there, at the bottom of a narrow gorge, where sunlight barely reached even at noon, covered by 63 years of fallen leaves, branches, and vegetation growth, was a Cessna 182. The airplane had impacted nose first, causing it to partially burrow into the soft gorge floor and become wedged between rock walls only 3 meters apart. Decades of erosion and plant growth had partially filled in around the wreckage, effectively burying it 6 meters below the surrounding forest surface. The fuselage was severely damaged, but surprisingly intact, and still visible, though faded and partially obscured by lichen, were blue letters along the side. Sky Dancer. "Jesus Christ!" whispered one of the rescue team members. "How long has this been here?" Inside the crushed cabin, still secured by the seatbelt, was a human skeleton dressed in remnants of jeans and flannel shirt. In the baggage compartment behind were deteriorated bags that had contained mail, now just fragments of paper and mold. The news spread quickly. "Aircraft missing for 63 years found. In deep Colorado gorge," screamed the headlines. Within days, forensic experts were at the site, carefully documenting everything before the difficult task of recovering the remains, both human and aircraft. Sarah Johnson, now 69 years old, living in Boulder, Colorado, received the call from authorities on June 25th. They had found her father's airplane. They had found his remains. After 63 years, they finally knew what had happened to Andrew Johnson. She cried, not tears of fresh sadness, but tears of an old wound finally being acknowledged. She called her brother William, now 66 years old, and retired in Phoenix. They shared a moment of silence on the phone, processing news they had waited for their entire lives, but which came too late to matter to the person who needed it most. Their mother, Patricia, dead 6 years ago. The forensic investigation of the crash took weeks, but eventually painted a clear picture. Based on the angle of impact and damage to the structure, the Cessna had entered a steep dive and impacted the gorge at high speed. There was no evidence of mechanical failure. The engine, though corroded, showed to have been running at impact. The flight controls, to the extent they could be examined after decades of deterioration, showed nothing obviously wrong. The most likely theory was disturbingly simple. Andrew had flown into severe mountain turbulence. Powerful downdrafts known as wind shear can grab small airplanes and throw them downward with force that no engine can overcome. If Andrew was caught in such an event while flying through this narrow valley, he would have had seconds, perhaps less, to react. Not enough time for a radio call. Not enough time to recover altitude. Just enough time to realize he was falling. And then, impact. The gorge where he fell was particularly cruel. Narrow, deep, and densely forested, it was invisible from above. Aerial searches in 1962 had passed over this area several times, but the tree canopies formed a continuous cover that completely hid the gorge below. Even if searchers had passed directly over the site, and they probably did, they would have seen nothing but uninterrupted forest. Ground searches had also probably passed nearby, but the gorge was sufficiently steep and overgrown that unless someone was literally standing at the edge and looking directly down, they would not see the wreckage 6 meters below, among the densely packed trees. The Sky Dancer had fallen in literally the worst possible place to be found with 1962 technology. And there it remained, while the world changed around it, while those who loved Andrew died without answers, while decades of leaves and debris buried it more deeply, until finally modern technology that could see through trees revealed what human searches never could. Andrew Johnson was finally buried in August of 2025 at Green Lawn Cemetery in Denver, beside Patricia. The ceremony was small. Sarah and William, some grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some aviation historians. A quartet of pilots flew over the cemetery in missing man formation, an aviation tradition where one airplane breaks formation and climbs, symbolizing the fallen pilot. The headstone read, Andrew Michael Johnson, 1925 to 1962, pilot, father, husband, finally flying in peaceful skies. The wreckage of the Skydancer was eventually recovered and donated to the wings over the Rockies Air and Space Museum in Denver, where a section is dedicated to historic aviation accidents. Visitors can see what remains of the Cessna 182, can read about Andrew Johnson and his disappearance, can reflect on the dangers that pilots faced before modern safety technologies. The case of Andrew Johnson remains as a powerful reminder of several truths about aviation and life. First, that even the most experienced and cautious pilots are not immune to forces of nature. Andrew had flown for 17 years without incident, had survived World War II, had navigated thousands of flights through treacherous mountains. But a single event, a patch of severe turbulence in an unlucky location, was enough to end everything in seconds. Second, that accidents in remote mountainous terrain can be nearly impossible to find without modern technology. The 1962 searches were extensive and conducted by dedicated and skilled people. They simply did not have the tools to see through dense forests or map deep gorges. It took LiDAR, technology that would not exist for more than 50 years, to finally locate what human eyes had searched for in vain. Third, that closure is important, but often comes too late. Patricia Johnson spent 57 years as a widow, not knowing exactly what had happened to her husband. Sarah and William grew up without a father and without answers. Tom Harrison and Robert Chen carried unnecessary guilt for decades. All died or aged before the truth emerged. The knowledge now available that Andrew was simply victim of tragic circumstances, not pilot error, not maintenance negligence, just cruel bad luck, would have consoled but came generations too late. For the aviation community, the case serves as solemn reminder that even in the 21st century with all our technologies, flying carries inherent risks. The atmosphere is a complex, three-dimensional fluid that can change instantly, from benign to lethal. Mountains create wind patterns that can destroy aircraft. And when things go wrong in the air, events unfold in seconds where entire lives end. Andrew Johnson woke on August 23, 1962, expecting a routine 25-minute flight. He kissed his wife. He planned a picnic with his children in the afternoon. He performed a perfect pre-flight inspection. He took off in ideal conditions. And then, at some point in the following 25 minutes, he encountered an atmospheric phenomenon that his training and experience could not overcome. He fell and remained hidden from the world for 63 years, while his family wondered eternally where he had gone. The tragedy is not just in his death. Deaths happen. Accidents are part of the human condition. The tragedy is in the absence of knowledge, in the decades of unanswered questions, in the agony of not knowing that slowly corroded everyone who loved him. If the airplane had been found in 1962, the pain would have been acute but clean. Instead, it was a wound that never closed, bleeding slowly for decades. And now, in 2025, we have answers. Andrew Johnson has been found. His fate is known. But for whom do these answers matter? His parents, long dead. His wife, dead 6 years ago. His fellow pilots, all passed. Even his children, now elderly, process this news through lenses of entire lives lived without him. The answers came. But they came as whispers over graves, relevant mainly to historians and those with academic interest in solved mysteries. The personal pain, the real loss, the agony of not knowing, all of that was lived and endured by people who never knew the truth. The mystery of Andrew Johnson is solved. But the sadness of a life cut short at 37 years, of children raised without a father, of a wife who waited more than half a century for answers that came only after her death, that sadness cannot be resolved. It remains a silent testament to the fragility of life and the cruelty of chance. The sky had claimed Andrew Johnson in 1962. The forest guarded him for 63 years. And now, finally, the earth held him properly. Beside the woman who loved and waited for him, and surrounded by memory of what was and what might have been if the wind that day had blown just a little differently, if he had flown just 50 meters higher, if the weather had been just a little less treacherous. Sometimes the skies are merciless, and sometimes the earth keeps secrets very well. And the intersection of these two truths created a mystery that endured for 3 generations before finally revealing its sad and simple answer. Andrew Johnson fell, and the forest hid him until technology could finally see through its green veil and find the man that the sky had stolen very, very long ago. The music silenced. The flight ended. And after 63 years of questions, finally, there is an answer. Too late to comfort, but perhaps early enough to teach the next generation of pilots to respect the mountains, the weather, and the thin line between flying safely and disappearing from the sky forever.